So obviously Ryan Grimm, who works for The Intercept, has positioned himself pretty publicly against things like Force the Vote, for example. And that's really caught the attention and ire of popular comedian Jimmy Dore, who, of course, has a very impassioned fan base. If you've ever been on this space with any regularity, you know that. And if you make content in the space, you most certainly know that. But anyway, I preface that to say that I take a little bit of issue with the way Ryan Grimm talks about this. He says, when you've made it your personal mission to attack someone no matter what, again, referring to Jimmy Dore's coverage of himself, this is the insanity you end up with if there's nothing to attack. And he's talking about this piece that Ryan Grimm wrote. But again, I just think it's a little bit, I don't know the word. It's a little bit, you're kind of omitting something here, Ryan, because you're failing to talk about the fact that you've lobbed several critiques yourself at not just Jimmy Dore, but his ideas and associated movements and organizations. And speaking of the People's Party, we've had plenty of critiques ourselves. We've even released articles about it, exposés even. But honestly, the critiques that I've seen Ryan Grimm publicly make against the People's Party and associated organizations and movements have been fairly disingenuous and sometimes just straight up lazy and dumb. I'm reminded, too, of the recent attacks against the Green Party for coming out against H.R. 1 and also trying to link Kristen Sinema to the Green Party, even though he claims that was a joke. Again, it's instances like these where you can kind of say, like, well, if you wanted to uphold this objective journalistic vibe, maybe you shouldn't have publicly come at these organizations and movements with bad faith attacks. Clearly, that's going to in turn provoke some vitriol, and especially from someone who's literally a loudmouth comedian who self-identifies as that. Jimmy Dore is not really a journalist. I mean, maybe he calls himself a journalist.
He has before called himself that, yeah. Because I personally, every time he says that, I'm like, oh.
I mean, I feel like to whatever extent he does say that. I mean, he calls himself a fucking jagoff comedian way more, right?
Okay, I mean, yeah, fair enough. I think we may slightly disagree on this, but we can play the clip and react to it.
Okay, yeah, well, that's perfectly fine, and I'm interested to hear your guys' opinion. And to be fair, I'm not totally, defending Jimmy Dore in this instance, but I will play the clip so we can get a better sense of what's being talked about here. But again, a lot of people were calling this completely unfair on Jimmy Dore's part. They were saying that Jimmy Dore was totally over the line in his criticism of Ryan Grimm and characterizing his work at The Intercept. And I actually pulled the entire clip so that we can listen to the first minute or so and react. I definitely have some thoughts, and I'm sure you guys will as well.
Schumer eyes a second shot at raising the minimum wage through reconciliation. Democrats capitulated to a ruling by a Senate staffer, the body's parliamentarian, the first time around. This is by Ryan Grimm. He doesn't say Democrats ridiculously and transparently bullshittingly capitulated to a ruling by the Senate. He just said the Democrats did it. Not Chuck Schumer, by the way. This is called propaganda. If you don't know, if you want to see what propaganda looks like, Ryan Grimm, when he writes a column, that's what it is. So this is them doing propaganda for the Democratic Party. This is the Intercept. The ones who won't print the truth about the vice president's or the president's kid, that fired their best journalists because they wanted to do censorship. And then they sent Ryan Grimm out to shit on Force the Vote and all the progressive activists. Even his former employee, Brianna Joy Gray, he lied about.
So first off, it's obviously very clear that Jimmy Dore is a little bit in his feelings here and is personally offended by the fact that Ryan Grimm has come for him and forced the vote, which, like I said, Ryan Grimm should not have done if he wants to then, be like, why is this guy attacking me or whatever? So I think that's kind of dumb. And just a second, before you jump in, Zach, I want to be fair to Ryan Grimm too, because his main issue with this segment of Jimmy Dore is that Jimmy Dore essentially just called it a column when it wasn't a column. And this was not supposed to be Ryan Grimm's opinion necessarily. This was more of just a report. It was a scoop. As he says here, about this because I broke it. So do you have any initial opinions to this? Do you think that Jimmy Dore was fair in characterizing Ryan Grimm as basically a propagandist?
I think there are a lot of times when you can really fairly criticize Ryan Grimm. And I want to start that at the beginning here, because you're right. Like, that, the way that he sets up this tweet is obviously to defend himself, right? He says, when you made it your personal mission to attack somebody no matter what, right? Okay, Ryan Grimm has lobbed a fair amount of critiques at Jimmy Dore, which you could essentially just boiled himself down to, a comedian on Twitter. It would be like if Gavin and I got extremely successful and popular, and then Ryan Grimm was starting to tweet about us. Like, we're absolutely powerless here, and we don't claim to be professionals, right? But that being said, what I don't mind about this piece is that it is a scoop. And I feel like, this is kind of the presentation that I expect from The Intercept, right? Everything that I've been learned to understand about The Intercept is that they're going to be shooting for that, like, just left of neoliberal line. And I think that's the tone that Ryan Grimm strikes here. He does use the term capitulate, right? Democrats capitulated to a ruling by a Senate staffer, the body's parliamentarian, the fourth time around. He includes multiple positions, right? He's talked about how internal congressional critics of the Schumer idea argue that the link between the policy and whether it clears reconciliation is irrelevant. After all, blah, blah, blah. I mean, so I feel like he presents what I would consider to be in a vacuum, a perfectly standard, run-of-the-mill news piece. I guess maybe if you have higher standards for The Intercept and what The Intercept purports to be, you might expect something differently, but this is the exact kind of tone I expect somebody like Ryan Grimm to strike. Like, not necessarily like excoriating Chuck Schumer like Jimmy Dore wants, but not necessarily like 100% covering for him either.
Right. Well, I think that's part of Jimmy's criticism here. And again, I'm not trying to stand for Jimmy Dore or like defend him whenever he does something, but I do think that it's worth noting that obviously, one, his show is supposed to be comedic in value, so it's not like everything he says is supposed to be like objective and measured, for example. And two, I would say that he's kind of making a critique, which I agree with, which is at that very tonality that, reporters and the media at large uses when talking about politicians and people in power. That's not to say that Ryan Grimm should have written this piece and said, useless, pathetic, weak Chuck Schumer capitulates to Democrats or whatever, Jimmy Dore would have said. That's not necessarily true. But the way that pieces like this are written do tend to exclude or omit facts like why it was, why Chuck Schumer took it out the first go around. Why would Chuck Schumer be considering putting in a $15 minimum wage into this package when him and his, party were instrumental in removing it from the first package? Like, why? Because, and I think part of the frustration too is that a lot of liberals on Twitter are sharing this article and articles like this to then shame people that, criticized the
Cenk Uygur style. That's what he was tweeting about the other day. Yeah.
Right. Because then you can take this, headline and say, well, calm down, everyone. They are fighting for a minimum wage. Chuck Schumer is fighting for a $15 an hour. You guys, everyone needs to calm down and stop complaining so much because they just kick the can down the road a little bit more and they are going to fight for it. Don't worry. When in reality, that's probably not going to happen either. I have a really good shot, or I have a really good prediction or feeling that when the time comes that, the parliamentarians' ruling is still going to matter more than what Chuck Schumer claims to want. And that's kind of the problem with these sort of pieces, is that they give momentary cover because a lot of people will see this and, go, whew, it's all good. The Democrats are still the party of the people. They're still fighting for us. And then they forget about this until 2 or 3 months down the road. And then, whatever happens and the parliamentarian makes their ruling and, the Democrats fail again. And not to say that that's definitely going to happen, but that's probably what's going to happen. And I think to kind of omit that context is a little bit problematic in this context when, again, $15 minimum wage was on the Democratic Party platform. It was something that Joe Biden ran on unequivocally. It's not like a, crazy position that was politically in danger of getting passed. This is something the Democrats should have committed to, should have fought for. It's something they promised to do those things for. So while I agree that, Ryan Grimm wasn't or shouldn't be expected to express, big opinions in his reports, I do think that the media, just in the very way they cover this sort of thing, does end up covering for the powerful, for the establishment.